Welcome back. This is actually part two of the presentation of the slides regarding Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the DARPA case study, and in particular the concepts of really this idea of good strategy, bad strategy, what is the core strategy, and ultimately the key takeaway for today will be about focus and trade-offs. This is part two. The first, if you haven't seen the first part, probably should watch that first. But also, didn't even realize as I was doing it that certainly the first part took longer than I planned, like an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm actually uploading it for viewing as I'm recording this part. So I'll try to be, I was conscious of trying to talk methodically and slowly and deliberately and enunciate, because I don't always do those things well. But it ended up taking a lot longer than I wanted to. So I'm not going to try to talk faster or enunciate less, but I'll totally try to get through the second part a little faster than I did that first part. So I don't want to end up having my, if you will, lecturing on DARPA take the full 4 hours that actually sitting in a class and having the discussion and the lecture would have taken otherwise. So now to review, remember that we were trying to understand DARPA's successful strategy and ultimately asking this question about what is a strategy, what is a good strategy. We're combining ideas. We were sort of reviewing some of the ideas from the What is Strategy article by Porter, which was from our last time. We were talking explicitly about the Coors case study. But our two new readings on The Perils of Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt and Can You Save Your Strategy is by David Collis and Mike Ruckstad. From these latter two readings, from The Perils of Bad Strategy, we had this idea of, after describing what is bad strategy, Rummelt talks about what is a good strategy, kernel of good strategy. He talked about it being the diagnosis of the challenge, the guiding policy, and a set of coherent actions being the three elements of a kernel of good strategy. And Collis and Ruckstad talking about, in the article Can You Save Your Strategy, is talking about the elements of strategy statement being objective, scope, and advantage, where advantage includes the sort of value proposition, what we've sort of talked about in terms of added value before, and the activity system. We'd actually, and these correspond, of course, to questions of why, where, what, and how, as far as about strategy. Now, in part one, we covered the why and the where. So now we're going to talk about of course, what remains is the what and the how. And so we're talking about the what now, which is really, as we said, the what question is about advantage. Right? Remember the kernel of good strategy, the guiding policy, what Rummelt is talking about in the guiding policy is really about scope and advantage. It's about strategic positions, what it really is, what he's describing. And when Collis and Ruckstad conversely talk about this third element of strategy statement being about advantage, what they're really talking about is actually two things. I actually don't know why they grouped it into one, but the value proposition, which is really sort of about the external, strategic positioning of the organization, and then internally thinking about advantage or activity system. So let's talk about one thing that is an element of both the guiding policy that Rummelt talks about and the advantage that Collis and Ruckstad talk about, which is this idea of the what of strategy. Now, what is this what? It's about advantage. What is the unique comparative advantage or added value the organization achieves or seeks to achieve relative to alternatives, rivals, substitutes, or entrants? Right? That is the question that both of them, whether it's the guiding policy or the advantage part, what is addressed. Now, we've talked about before, but we go into greater detail about the what. And we've already talked about this. It ultimately comes down to things like willingness to pay, cost, the gap between the two, and added value. I'm not going to repeat. This was emphasized in the case discussion of the MBA and MPS case study, so I'm not going to go repeat that. But we'll highlight some aspects. So remember, we're talking here about this idea of advantage. Superior performance is based on, combination of having a favorable external environment. That could be helping you achieve superior performance, but also your advantage within that environment, your comparative advantage within that environment. But we talked about comparative advantage. It really has two elements. One is operational effectiveness, about basically doing the same things better, or superior strategic position, about doing different things. Right? And so when we're talking about, this question of advantage is from a strategy perspective. We've talked about how operational effectiveness is really not part of strategy. That that might be part of operations, management, logistics, but it's not really a strategy question. But when we talk about advantage from a strategy perspective, we're talking about superior strategic position. Now, the new reading on Can You Say What Your Strategy Is talks about this idea of a strategic sweet spot. Right? And they said, look, there's some context. This is your external environment. Right? Your industry, technology, regulation, demographics, everything we talked about we would analyze. We did an external analysis of an organization. Within that environment, right, you've customers who have certain needs. You have competitors who have certain offerings, right? And hopefully, presumably, those offerings overlap with those needs or solving some needs. And then what can you do, right? And so what can your organization or your company do, right? And those are your capabilities. And they talked about the strategic sweet spot being where your company's capabilities intersect with your customers' needs, right? But not here in the middle, not where competitors also can satisfy those needs, but where you're capable of satisfying customer needs in a way that competitors are not. And they talk about that is the sweet spot. That is what where you're trying to position your organization. Now, originally I titled the slide "Positioning in the Strategic Sweet Spot," as if there was, as if it was completely exogenously given, right? But of course, you can choose by your choices to choose. Your whole thing about balance of advantages is about choosing how to balance capabilities. You can choose what you'll be good at and what you might not be good at, right? And so the idea is that you actually are creating that sweet spot by your choices of positioning. But ultimately, the idea is that where you're going to add value over and above what competitors offer, satisfying customer needs in a way that competitors cannot, is this idea of the sweet spot. And this is one of the pictures sort of from that reading on Can You Say What Your Strategy Is? Now, this is not new per se. It's a new way of representing it. But let's go back to the way we've talked about it before. Remember, we talked about strategic positioning most generically in terms of balancing degree of differentiation and relative cost, right? And we asked the question about what is the best position along the frontier to pursue, and I gave you some complicated diagrams that sort of explained, but ultimately said, look, it's about where you have the greatest added value. You position along the frontier wherever you have the greatest added value, based on what potential value you create, right? Your willingness to pay minus cost. What is it that you can, what is the value you are capable of creating? Right? So these are sort of your capabilities. Where are the competitors' positions, and where are the customers' needs? Where are the customer positions? So really, we've already talked about this sweet spot. We've defined it in this way, right? And then they've just sort of given us the Venn diagram, that articulates certainly probably better than what I did, right? Although I think I was doing it a little more meticulously and precisely, but this idea of what it means to have a sweet spot where you would like to be. Now, for the DARPA case study, right? We apply this. We said we pointed out. Remember, of course, more generally that strategic positioning is not necessarily balancing about just willingness to pay versus cost, but any advantages, right? Any two capabilities for which there is a trade-off, for which there is a inherent trade-off between the advantages. Right? And in defense research, and in particular for the problem facing DARPA, is the decision about balancing advanced research versus applied research. What do we mean by advanced research versus applied research? Well, advanced research is the research with the huge potential business benefit, high risk of failure, uncertain application, right? More invention, right? Really generating something new, as opposed to applied research, research that is a predictable benefit, right? You sort of a low risk of failure, right? Lower reward, lower risk, right? And sort of a known application. You know where you're going to actually apply it. And this is more innovation. This is the idea of innovation versus invention. Innovation is more about taking existing ideas and putting them together in a new or unique way to create value that wasn't available previously, right? Whereas invention is sort of really the coming up with the whole new idea. Right? And we'll talk about invention versus innovation a little bit more when in our next module on dynamic analysis. Right? But so there's this idea of how much advanced versus applied research should you do. And so I asked the question about strategic positioning in defense research. Right? And we asked, you were asked, where would you put DARPA on this frontier? Right? And of course, where you put an organization is always dependent upon where you put others. Right? It's always relative. So where would you put the service, science, technology organizations like the Office of Naval Research, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the Army Research Office? These are their head or science and technology organizations. What about standard DoD acquisition? The standard acquisition of, I want a particular software program that does this. doesn't exist currently. It's not an off-the-shelf necessarily thing, but it's a pretty basic sort of application. What about university basic research, right? The what we really would call basic research for the fundamental understanding done, for example, at universities. And what about corporate research? Now there are other research organizations, but all these are organizations that do research that sometimes, whether they know it or not, ultimately might have a military or defense application. And so we certainly have the discussion about where we position these organizations. I asked you in the quiz about, sort of where would you best A, B, C, D, E, and certainly multiple answers could be correct for any one organization as far as how I graded the quiz and things. But I wanted you to think about things relatively. It wasn't necessarily my intention. I gave you 5 and 5 options. I didn't necessarily mean that one had to be E, one had to be D. I didn't necessarily mean that, but I wanted you to think about relatively where they would be, right? And I think based on our discussion on Tuesday and our other discussions that I've had on this, one idea was, if you think about of those things, what is doing the most advanced research, right? In other words, who really is doing advanced research without much application, without much thought of what it's going to be used for? Who is doing the research in the Bohr's quadrant? Remember that diagram from, I think I said Renee Duggan. It's actually Regina Duggan, as I thought more. I haven't looked, but now I'm thinking it's Regina Duggan, former DARPA director. And really, who is figuring out the structure of the atom, or doing this superconducting super collider or whatever over in CERN? Right? Well, it's universities primarily. Academics are doing the basic research. Folks who want to expand, like knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? That's sort of the most advanced research that's being done in the world. In any field that's typically where it's done. Right? What about on the other extreme, more applied? Now, there's certainly, if we think about the idea of DoD acquisition, the basic acquisition, it's not sort of designed to foster really advanced research that you don't certainly, say, oh, well, there's some, risk of failure. So, hey, we want to do something that, might not work at all. No, you want a particular solution for a particular problem. It's very much, sort of the most applied, and if it's off the shelf, it's not really even research, right? But to the extent it's not off the shelf, and some innovation will have to take place, some new programming or design or something will have to take place, by the contractor, etc. Then it is, but it's really very applied research. Now, corporate research, right? Ultimately, that's got to be pretty applied too, right? They care about the bottom line. But there's certainly some argument. You think about, the pioneers of things like, you think about Xerox PARC, which is Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which pioneered the, we'll talk about the Apple case study next week, but, it was really the pioneers of the mouse, the point and click, graphic user interface, all that sort of stuff, right? And others, whether it's HP Labs or, other, Google and investing in the driverless car, these sort of things, there's certainly an argument to be made that corporations some at least are willing to look, farther down the road, than the standard DoD acquisition. Right? Again, of course, we have elements of DoD that are doing more advanced research than that. The service science technology organizations they're obviously not doing something as short term and as applied and as guaranteed benefit. They're willing to take a little more risks in their investments, certainly, than the standard DoD acquisition process. Right? And then arguably DARPA is supposed to be doing stuff that the services won't do. Because it is, as they said in their own strategy, because it's a little too risky, because it challenges existing things, it's not as applied. It doesn't match as well, right? So DARPA, by definition, is supposed to be positioned above both DoD acquisition, but also the service S&T, sort of. So they're supposed to be doing a little more advanced research. On the other hand, they're also not supposed to be in Bohr's quadrant, which is doing basic university research, right? Basic research. So that they're not the university, not just trying to figure out the structure of the atom. They're ultimately not. They do care about the application and practical benefits. So they're not. They're and you could position them a little lower. But the bottom line is, DARPA, based on their own description, is supposed to be being a little more applied than university basic research, but more advanced than anything done by the services. Right? So again, this idea of as far as the quiz is concerned, I would accept multiple different answers for these things, right? But ultimately, something along these lines, right? DARPA certainly should probably be between the university research and the service S&T, right? In corporate research and DoD acquisition are more applied. I would contend that corporate research, although there's different levels of it, some of it is certainly more advanced than your basic DoD acquisition. So I think this is an accurate representation, or roughly accurate representation of the relative positioning. Right? But this again shows you. So the takeaways of this are not only the case-specific takeaways are: where is DARPA live? Where is DARPA's home? Where do they need to make sure they position themselves? They need to position themselves with a little more, to be distinctive, to be unique. What is their unique position? Remember, strategic positioning about choosing a unique position along the frontier. So they need to position themselves doing a little more advanced work than anything else in DoD, right? But not necessarily doing stuff that's so advanced that the application is, not clear, or far away, or, not quite advanced as basic research done at universities. Now, that's the first sort of takeaway from this diagram. The second takeaway, of course, is more generally this idea of that understanding that strategic positioning is about finding a unique position along the productivity frontier when they're positioning and balancing two advantages, not necessarily just willingness to pay and cost, right? But any two advantages for which there is an inherent trade-off. Right, and so that's sort of, again, that sort of covers this idea of advantage, the what, right? And of course, to be clear, we spent the entire day of the MBA at MPS case study talking about the what, right? So we've already covered that to great degree. So that's why I didn't say much more about it now. And what about the how? This is sort of the third element of the kernel of good strategy is a, quote, set of coherent actions, according to Rummelt. But it's also part of the notion of advantage, according to Collis and Ruckstad, who wrote the Can You Say What Your Strategy is this idea of an activity system. So that's sort of the how, if you will, the how of strategy. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what Rummelt means in terms of the set of coherent actions and what Ruckstad and Collis mean in terms of the activity system. Now, we already covered it to some level last week with the course case study, but I'm actually going to cover it to some depth here because I think there's some important insights we didn't get to. Although I've added some to the slides that I put on course, some of the slides that you'll see here. Right? But I wanted to go in a little more depth into these notions. So now we're addressing we've talked about the what, the where, and now, of course, we've got to the how of strategy, right? Activities. How does the organization seek to achieve and sustain its advantage? And so from the perspective of Richard Rummelt and the kernel of good strategy, we're talking about now the coherent actions, the coordinated steps. Right? You've diagnosed the challenge that you have to overcome. You've determined a guiding policy or overall approach. And now the idea is, what are the coherent actions or coordinated steps that you're going to take to get you there? Now, we've actually, of course, this is not the first time, we've talked about activities. In fact, all the module concept readings emphasize the importance of activities in support of strategy. Right? We've had now, just remember the 4 different concept readings in this module. We had Creating Competitive Advantage by Rifkin and Gamawat. We had the What is Strategy by Michael Porter, The Perils of Bad Strategy, Richard Rummelt, and the Can You Say What Your Strategy is by David Collis and Mike Ruckstad. And all of them have talked about the importance of activities in support of strategy. And we've talked about, this is not going to be the first time we've talked about the how question. But what do they all have in common? Well, they all agree on 2 key requirements when it comes to activities in support of strategy. The first is that that it takes unique or distinct activities to produce advantage. Right? You cannot be different if you don't do something different. If you do the same thing as everybody else, you're not going to have an advantage. You are going to be just like everyone else. The only way you could have an advantage over another organization or over alternatives is that you actually do something different, right? Something unique or distinct. And the second thing is that it's not just about the individual activities. It's about the system of activities, how they fit together, right? The activities have to have fit. Other words we've used: alignment, coherence, consistency, coordination. These are all sort of the same ideas. And I'll talk very specifically about examples of what we mean by fit. And I've now got slides specifically on what Porter talks about, the 3 different levels or orders of fit. Let's talk about the first one, though. Again, the idea of unique or distinct activities, right? The fact that you need to do something different, something unique or different to produce advantage. Again, we've talked about this with the course case. and the course case was focused on activities, but we're going to go into more detail. Now remember, we talked about, just to review, we talked about this idea of strategy being about competing to be unique, right? And I talked about with the course case, this idea of the traditional thinking about competing to be the best, right? And what that entails, and the focus and the mindset, the idea of running the same race, about focusing on doing the same things better, right? Ultimately producing a zero-sum game that not only that one organization's gain is the other one's loss, as opposed to competing to be unique, running a different race, right? You can have more than one winner, right? And all parties can ultimately gain, right? Trying to be different, and so the idea here is, again, and I found this graphic since we did the course case. I just found it in the last few days. Competitive strategy is about being different. Right? Here is the, I'm guessing, raspberry among the blackberries, right? But I don't know my berries very well. About standing out, about being different. And we've used the example, and we're going to go into even more detail about IKEA. Right? I think it's a good example because it's a company, an organization everybody knows, everybody's familiar with, so we don't have to stretch too much. Now think about IKEA and what they're trying to do. Right? We'll talk about their distinct activity choices. And we talked about this before already, but understand what they're trying to do. Their activity system is targeted, is tailored to serve basically young families primarily, young furniture buyers who want style at low cost. They want some style, but they want it cheap, they want it inexpensive, and they're willing to do a lot of the work themselves. And so you can sort of see here, we went over this last time, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail, and plus IKEA will come up later, right, about the different things that IKEA does on the left compared to the corresponding activity of a typical furniture retailer on the right. And in each case, in order to have an advantage, you've got to do something different. And you can sort of see the idea of the things that IKEA does, right, to try to create low-cost options for this target market, right, is really tailored to its particular target, particular value proposition, to being low cost, to serving this particular segment, right? And so again, the idea is that strategies about these distinct activity choices. We of course, that was one of the big themes of the CORES discussion, and I talked about what does ADAPT CORES do, and I asked you about the different key activities that ADAPT CORES does, or was doing in '77 that were different than Anheuser-Busch. Remember, in '77, ADAPT CORES was the most profitable beer maker in North America and had almost double the income per barrel as Anheuser-Busch, even though Anheuser-Busch was 3 times as big. But notice I also challenged you in each case not only to list the distinct activities, and that's the point right now, is that they're distinct, but also sort of foreshadowing where we're going to go, to think about the benefit, the value of those activities to CORES. So each one of these distinct choices, I asked you what the benefit was, why CORES, what the standalone benefit is of that activity choice for CORES, right? But also, when Anheuser-Busch makes their choices, what's the benefit to them of that, right? The choices make sense for each of them. Well, what is Anheuser-Busch thinking? How do they benefit from their choices? And how does CORES benefit from theirs, right? So you're already getting the idea that it's not that one choice is right and one is wrong, right? They might be they each bring benefits, and based on the overall strategy, one makes sense for each. Different choices may make sense for different organizations. And so then, of course, we had the discussion about DARPA. What is it that DARPA does that is unique, right? And so I challenge students to look at what is the unique activity, if you will, on the left. So what is it that they do that's different from other research organizations, other DoD entities, but also outside DoD research, or research in general? And what's the point? What's the value or advantage of that, right? And so this is sort of like asking you, what does CORES do different from Anheuser-Busch, and what's the benefit to CORES of doing that? Well, we're doing the same thing for DARPA. And so I've got a couple pages here of notes from things we talked about in class on Tuesday, but also in other classes on this. But things like the idea of these sort of key activities, things like the program managers, talented, motivated, connected, right, to the community, program managers, right, the short-term limits, rapid turnover, right, allowing them to have, people are there for 3 to 5 years, 3 to 6 years, depending on what you look, about 3 to 5 years, and constantly, sort of turnover, new ideas, avoid inertia, right? Outsourcing, right? They, don't have to, they don't own any labs, they don't even do any of their own research, they outsource all of that, right? There's a limit, certainly their upfront capital requirements, but they're sort of easy to let go of the project, they're not as invested, no ownership, sort of inertia, we might call that the endowment effect, we've called about that a bias. Freedom from bureaucracy, right? The independence from the military services. Small, flexible, flat agency structure, right? The idea that they work right to left in the R&D pipeline. They don't necessarily come up with ideas and then see where they take them. A lot of organizations do that. They come up with technologies and then they, I think about research I used to do on Sharp, and they would come up to the LCD screens and then figure out where they could use them. Right. Whether it's in phones or cameras or video. But the idea was the technology was developed, and then the seed was developed, and then the need was identified, as opposed to the way around. Radical as opposed to incremental, right? High tolerance for risk and failure. Right? He who makes the most mistakes wins, right? But also these strict rules for project acceptance. They have strict guidelines, as we've sort of seen, we've already gone over, that they make sure that they don't just, there's strict rules that they have to follow. Right, only DARPA hard projects, right? Things that fit that category, significant impact, but also potential for near-term results, right? A big impact, but also not a big impact necessarily 20 years from now, but actually, during the time frame that might have this program manager. So we can each identify all these unique activities that are unusual, for a research organization, and particularly a defense research organization, and how they benefit, how the different choices benefit DARPA. So that's the idea of the unique or distinct activities, but also, this idea that all the readings agree, it's also not about the individual activity, it's about the system of activities, how they fit together, right? And we've seen different language for these. Again, fit, alignment, coherence, consistency, coordination. Now, Richard Rummelt talks about a set of, quote, set of coherent actions, right? And so what does he mean by that? Well, the idea is that everything's sort of coordinated together, right? Ultimately, you're trying to accomplish the guiding policy in a coordinated way. The actions build upon one another. What you learn in one area, it helps in another area. So the idea that it's not just the left hand knows the right hand doing, but the left hand is actually helping, making the right hand's jobs easier, and vice versa. Right? And that was the theme we talked about, by the way, when we did these activity system maps. So this is actually, although we have bigger pictures later, this is IKEA's, this is Southwest here at the bottom, right? He emphasized the idea, by the way, relating it back to the idea of the goals or objectives, right? If you've got a good proximate objective, like an objective that's achievable for the next year or next quarter or whatever like that, there's an advantage that you can actually coordinate and achieve coherent or coordinated action if everybody's working towards the same short-term goal. Right? If it's a very long-term goal, it can be very abstract and very difficult for individual managers or even frontline employees to know exactly how their activities on a day-to-day basis, either move forward towards that goal or not. But if you've got these clear proximate objectives, it helps coordination without actually, communicated from above, as opposed to having to require communication between activities. Not that that's not a good thing, but as long as there's a clear objectives, you can maybe coordinate actions across a very diverse organization. Now, this is not in the reading, of course, but it's in the book. So there's a good example here. This is another reason I recommend the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book for this particular audience. Is that there's a lot of military references. I talked about the whole idea of bad strategy. He says came about thinking about national military strategy, and a lot of individual examples you're reading does talk about Horatio Nelson, in the British Navy. Right, is the first reference in the reading that you do have in the Perils of Bad Strategy. But in general, a lot of references to military strategy. Now, and here's a story about when he talks about coherence. Right, Rummelt gives an example from someone who is Hannibal, who is known as the father of strategy. Obviously, the father of military strategy. Right, and there's some idea, at least, that really before this time, military actions didn't really reflect much strategy. You bring in your army, I bring my army, we line up and we fight each other head to head. It was competing to be the best, not competing to be unique in any way, right? I mean, it was basically about, is mine bigger than yours, right? There would be certainly revolutions in military affairs, new technologies, etc., but that would change the nature of warfare. But ultimately, there wasn't a lot of strategy involved. Maybe innovation, but not so much strategy. Now, so he's giving the example of what happened, what Hannibal did at the Battle of Cannae, and I can't necessarily pronounce it Cannae. I'm not sure how I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I probably should know that. But this is 216 BC, so a long time ago. 2200 years ago, I guess. So And it's an example where Hannibal had only 40,000 troops versus twice as many Romans, right? But Hannibal destroyed them. And how did he do it? Right? The first thing he did was, it's all about this coordinated, again, it's about coherent and coordinated action. So what happened was, he had in the middle of his lines, sort of charge at the Romans in a sort of boat out formation, so that the middle of their lines were going to hit the Roman lines first. Right? And what happened here was that as soon as they hit the Roman lines, though, he instructed his lines, he had a lot of different groups here making up his army, Spaniards and Celts, to actually retreat, to hit the Roman lines, put up some resistance, and then retreat and fall back, so that instead of being an outward-shaped bow, there would be an inward-shaped bow. Eventually, you sort of see it's an inward-shaped bow, right? So retreat. Now, by doing that, by making the middle soft, if you will, what it was doing was the Romans gave them illusion of success, and they just charged even faster. It also steered them towards the middle of Hannibal's lines. In other words, he didn't tell the edges to retreat, but he told the middle to retreat. Right? So at the edge of his front line here, they sort of stayed where they were, but the middle fell back, and so that naturally channeled the Roman soldiers into the middle of Hannibal's line. Meanwhile, on the edges here, right, he had his cavalry first sort of scatter. He did have an advantage in cavalry, scatter the enemy cavalry. Right? So you see here, this is sort of illustrating them scattering the enemy cavalry. Right? But then once they did that, whatever cavalry was not chasing away the enemy cavalry was going to circle back around to the back and flank the enemy. Right? And meanwhile, the sides which he had held back, of his foot soldiers before, were then to go around the edges. Basically, it ends up being an encirclement of the Romans. And the consequence was, so what happens is after he does all this stuff, the Romans are surrounded, right? And they have 80,000 troops surrounded by 40,000. But when they're all bunched together like this, the Romans, only, very few of them, maybe 20,000 of their 80,000 troops were actually able to engage with the Carthaginians, because the rest were all stuck in the middle. They might be 10 yards away from their nearest the nearest of Hannibal's troops, because they were stuck in the middle. Right? And basically, they were able to, that way, Hannibal was able to take his 40,000, actually outnumber at the point of attack, where the Romans. Now, this is a very interesting military strategy story, but the point is, right, that think about this. He was giving, look at all these different elements: the Spaniards and Celts, the Africans, the Hannibal, the Numidians, the cavalry. He was giving all of these different instructions, right, to the different parts that, when put together, made sense. Retreating, in the middle doesn't in and of itself make sense. But if you're able to then flank them, with your cavalry, with your foot soldiers on the edge here, the Africans on the edge here, right? The idea was that he had all these different parts that together, with the idea of coherent action, is that when you put all of the activities of the different parts of Hannibal's force together, they make sense. Alone, maybe not as much, but together they make sense. And together, 40,000 Carthaginians are able to defeat 80,000 Romans. Not just defeat them, right? Out of the 80,000, it's estimated that 70,000 were killed, right? Tremendous loss ratio, including many major leaders for the Roman Empire. It was a devastating battle for Rome. And so that's sort of the Richard Rumelt's ideas on coherence, right? About coherent actions. I want to go back to Porter, though. Porter talked about fit. He didn't talk about coherence. His word was fit. I've used alignment, but Rumelt used coherence. Porter used fit. It's all the same idea. But Porter actually, he talks about different, in his reading on what is strategy: first order fit, second order fit, third order fit, right? And I've never really emphasized those too much. I've taught this for 18 years, this course, and taught this material that entire time. I've never really emphasized in great detail what each of those means. But what I've did was actually, since the course case, just in the last week, I created these slides you're about to see now, talking about, really illustrating what Porter means by fit. And he talked about the first order, second order, and third order. Now, with that in mind, understand, what I've done is I've actually added these slides to the core slides because they sort of should be part of the core's discussion, right? When we talk about internal alignment. But nonetheless, I'm going to present them here. Right? I think I've left them in both sets of slides. So Porter first talked about first order fit. What is it? This idea of consistency. And the idea here is this. The idea is of basic, he called it simple consistency, right? Is the idea that each individual activity, right, all the activities here, are all aligned with the overall strategic position, right, or the value proposition. That basically, they all are working towards the same goal, right? So in that sense, they are not, no activity is misaligned in terms of relative to the strategic position. So, for example, let's consider our example of IKEA. So IKEA has within its segment it's sort of a low-cost position, right? Certainly, arguably, some would argue within a certain segment, maybe a dual advantage. But the idea is they're trying to have an overall low-cost operation. Well, if you think about different activities, whether it be suburban locations with lower rent, the warehouses attached to the store, which eases distribution, having few, if any, sales associates on the showroom floor, having ready-to-assemble products in flat back boxes that customers self-assemble and self-deliver, all of those things are indeed consistent, right, with the low-cost position. That's sort of first-order fit of activities. Second order fit, he talks about reinforcement, right? The activities are reinforcing. So what is the idea here? The idea here is, look, you have some activity that you do, activity A, which has an independent value. So it does create value. It either lowers costs, raises willingness to pay within your target segment, but it expands the gap between willingness to pay minus cost in some way. So suppose this activity A, on its own creates value, $1 or one worth of value. It increases the gap between willingness to pay minus cost by 1 by pursuing that activity. And activity B, similarly, it also does raise willingness to pay or lowers cost or whatever it does, but it increases the gap between willingness to pay and cost by 1. But reinforcement means that putting them together, right, the combined value, instead of being 1 plus 1 and being 2, whatever like that, is that the combined value, there's something about the two in combination that creates value that could not be created independently. So the combined value is actually greater than 1 plus 1, right? And it's actually greater. And the example, again, let me give you the example of, at IKEA. Consider the idea of the suburban location with lower rent and easy access. We already said, and their activity B, the ready-to-assemble products in flat pack boxes. We already said how both of these sort of lower costs. They contribute to the low cost position, and therefore they each have independent value. But think about what happens when you put them together. Right? So again, just independently, suburban location means you have lower rent per square foot. That lowers costs. Putting everything in flat pack boxes, it makes it easy distribution to the stores, and it allows, of course, they actually have fewer defects, fewer returns, etc. because of the flat pack boxes. That lowers costs overall too. But you put them together. Think about the idea that now you've got suburban locations. What do you have in suburban locations? The big parking lots, easy access. They're right off the freeways. And you have everything sort of in these ready-to-assemble products in flat pack boxes that go nice and easily, by the way, what do you know, into the back of a car, or on top of a car, or in a truck. So together, these things independently of that, but together, you have a car-friendly location, items in flat packs. It makes easy customer self-delivery. Customers can easily drive there. They're not taking a subway. It's not an urban location. They can easily park. They can easily come up and pick up their products and pack, put it in the back of their car. So you basically have easy customer self-delivery because of the combination of these two activities. So the two activities, each activity individually has some value, but together they have even greater value. The third order fit, he calls it optimization of effort. In the reading, in the book by Joan Magretta I talked about earlier, about understanding Michael Porter, she actually refers to this as substitution. Right? And you'll see why. Right? But the idea is, look, you have some activity that's valuable, is valuable on its own, right? But also, it's not independent. If we looking at our 5 I's, we analyze it, incentives, information, interdependence, right? That this activity shares information with other activities to remove any redundancy, to make sure we're not duplicating any efforts across activities. You have activity choices that are interdependent, meaning what you do in one activity area affects what's optimal, or what you do in another activity area. They're not independent, right? It's the opposite of interdependent. And in particular, activity A changes activity B's cost or value, right? So if you do something different in this area, it affects the value or cost of what you might do in another area. So then you have another activity that now, because of what you've done in your activity, it actually makes this activity unnecessary, right? You've basically, by doing this, you've either reduced the value or basically the value of this other activity is subsumed by the first activity. So what do we mean by, again, these things are best illustrated by example. So think about IKEA. Think about this, we've already talked about the suburban location with lower rent and easy access. Okay, we gave that example. Well, the suburban location with lower rent and easy access, well, how does that affect other activities? Well, we've already talked about its interaction with the flat pack boxes, but let me talk about something different. So, for example, looking at incentives, cost, benefits, how things affected performance, information, interdependence. Well, having a suburban location, lower rent, you allow these huge stores, right? You couldn't have them downtown, but suburban, you get these big, huge stores. You have these huge stores. We already talked about how the huge stores, of course, allow you to have the warehouse attached to them, but they also allow you to have, of course, we all know IKEA, you walk through full room product displays, 40 different rooms, are on display within an IKEA store, right? And so you can see exactly, you don't have to guess how your couch will look or how it could be used or how this product interacts with other products. I mean, you can see it. They have all these full room displays of the products, so you can actually see for yourself, without any help, what the product does, how it fits, how it works with other products, etc., in these full room displays. And then they have, of course, they have detailed information tags on each item, right, describing it, the measurements and everything about it, right? Well, okay, so now you have this, because you've had the suburban location, which gives you the huge stores, which allows you to do these full room displays, you basically don't need sales associates on the showroom floor. I mean, trying to find sales associate at IKEA is kind of hard. I mean, there's a few of them, and they do have some customization options and for couches and things like that. But for the most part, right, only in some areas, and they're able to forego or give up or not have sales associates. They don't need them. It's something that would be a cost that has no value for them. And so this is the idea of optimization of effort, and that's why McGreta calls it substitution, because one activity substitutes for another. You can eliminate activity B because of what you do over here in activity A, right? And so that's the idea of third order fit. So we've talked about the idea of consistency with overall strategy, reinforcement of activities, so that 1 + 1 is greater than 2, right? And then ultimately substitution or optimization of effort. That what you do in one activity area means that you don't have to, you basically frees you up from doing something else. And so now, when you look at, and here's the activity system map of IKEA. This is actually scanned or copied over from the reading itself of what is strategy. Now you should begin to understand what these lines mean. These lines aren't just arbitrary, connections of, drawing lines between activities, right? I think sometimes students and, sometimes do projects, and I know that they've just sort of drawn lines, between activities to make it look like this. No, the point is that the activities are sort of first connected to these broader themes, right? So the overall idea of connected with the overall themes of the lower cost strategy, right? But they're also connected to each other, and so they're reinforcing, right? The connection is, the idea being that the connection between two activities means that there's some sort of reinforcement, but also this idea of that one activity choice allows you to totally change or eliminate what you do in one other activity area. That's what you should read into these linkages, right? And so let's go through this idea, and understand if you see the linkages that go on when we construct the activity system map for Dell Computer. Now, in some classes I was able to do that during the course discussion, and others we didn't have the time, and we didn't go through in this detail. So let me go through that and think about, to understand this idea of fit, alignment, coherence, let's think about Dell, and think about Dell's choices starting with one choice, right? And so this is sort of their activity system map, and I've broken it down, as you see, into procurement, production, marketing, distribution. Well, just think about one single activity choice, which is direct sales to customers. And what you're going to see is all of the other major activity choices that Dell has made are the logical extension of that choice, right? And in fact, one thing to understand is the activity system map that I'm about to create was not planned out from the beginning. In fact, I'll give some examples where Dell did not do it right? And they had to learn what the right thing to do was. But the point was fit basically means that one activity choice can as much as dictate another activity choice. Let's give examples. For example, if you do direct sales to customers, and the idea is, okay, well, who is going to buy direct from you, right? So this is really, by the way, notice an access-based positioning. Right, choosing direct sales. That's what you're choosing. Right. Okay. Well, who's going to buy from you? Well, we already sort of talked about this idea before when we talked about scope. Is that it's going to be the buyers who are going to buy from you are those who know what they want. So they don't need the hand-holding of the retailers, right, or the resellers. They also don't need the service, the add-on services of resellers. They don't need you to install their computer. They don't need you to maintain their system. So these are going to be educated self-service customers. They know what they want and they can help themselves. They don't need what the resellers or retailers add. So those are the people who are going to buy direct. right? So therefore, when you buy direct, obviously that sort of logically falls out. You sell direct. They don't need the hand-holding of the retailers. They don't need the added service of the resellers. So you avoid the retailers or resellers in distribution. Right? Okay. All right. Well, okay. If you're going to sell direct, avoid the retailers or resellers, you're obviously going to ship direct to the customer. Right? So again, we see that the one choice dictates the other ones. These aren't, so far, not so surprising. Then you say, okay, well, what about the product? Okay. So now you've determined your access, how you're going to sell to the customer, what type of customer you're going to sell to. Well, what type of product you're going to make? Well, you're going to make whatever they ask for. Well, okay, but what are they going to ask for? Well, they're not going to ask for the standard off-the-shelf computer they could get at, the retailer. They're going to ask for, they want a customized machine. And this type of customer tends to want the higher-end machines. They're not going to get the basic low-end, entry-level standard machines. They want higher-end customized machines. So again, your access choice, direct sales, has dictated your customer choice, which has dictated your product choice. Okay? Well, now the issue is, of course, if you're going to do customized machines, right, selling direct to these educated self-service customers, you're going to do built-to-order manufacturing, which again was not done at that time, right? IBM, Compaq, HP, all of their manufacturing was done what they call built-to-stock. They built a number of different models based on what they projected sales to be, right, or what there was going to be. But no, you're going to wait till you actually get the order before you even start building it. So these are built-to-order manufacturing, right? Again, seems to be now, look back, a natural sort of element of Dell's strategy, but understand that it sort of is a logical consequence of other choices, right? Well, okay, so if you're going to do built-to-order manufacturing of higher-end customized machines, what's the process for that? What's the best way to do it? Is it to do it on an assembly line, Well, actually, that's what Dell started out doing. Was an assembly line. The machine would come along and, they would say, okay, well, this guy wants this video card. Okay, we'll put that in. Or they want this, this additional memory, so you'd put it in. It would be like an assembly line manufacturing. Well, guess what? Dell figured out by accident that was not the way to do it. So instead, it turned out that customized machines were best built by cell manufacturer. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, it's a glorified, the simple version is, think of 4 guys in a cubicle with screwdrivers, right? They go in, they take the stuff, and they sort of put it together. And, and it's not assembly line, right? And again, that and now and then Dell, you can look at, there's educational or management education videos just on Dell's cell manufacturing techniques, right? As if they sort of figured those all out. No, they figured them out after the fact. In other words, that choice, that activity choice became appropriate given their other activity choice, given the building to order higher end customized machines, right? So they sort of stumbled their way to that. All right, well now what else, how else do these choices affect other activities? Well, one of the things is issue of, you're going to do built to order manufacturing, which means that low inventory becomes an issue. Now, maintaining low inventory is an issue throughout the PC business in general, because at this time, late 1990s, by 1998, the average cost of an input of a PC components was declining by 1% per year. Per week. Per week. What that means is if you were going to put a memory chip into a machine and you had bought it 5 weeks ago, you paid 5% too much. Somebody else who bought it today and put it in today would have a 5% cost advantage on that input. So you've got to maintain very low. You cannot have inventory sitting around. You've got to get it just before you use it. But that's a problem if you're doing built to order. It's not a problem if you're doing built to stock, right? IBM, Compaq, HP didn't have that problem because they would know today we're building this many of this model, and they would know exactly what they would need, and they would get it right before that, right? But for Dell, it was critical because they couldn't build a stock. They had to, so you have to wait till the customer orders to build it. Well, then the customer orders it, you better have what they want in stock. They want this memory chip. Oh, well, we don't have it. Well, so you've got to have the inventory there that you need. Well, what you need to have is, if you're doing built-to-order manufacturing with maintaining low inventory, you've got to have just-in-time inventory replenishment. And I assume in your logistics, your operations course, you've heard about just-in-time inventory replenishment, right? And Dell was a pioneer, a leader in that, another one who studied just for that part of their activity system. But again, this is not a choice that Dell, when he was building PCs out of his dorm room at University of Texas, which he was thinking, about doing. right? But it was a natural, logical consequence of these other choices. Okay, well, if you can have just-in-time inventory replenishment, right, but maintaining low inventory, how do you do that? Well, you've got to have very close ties to your suppliers. In fact, a lot of the suppliers co-located in Austin, where Dell was. There's articles, Google the phrase, instead of vertical integration, Google virtual integration and Dell. And they talk about this idea of their systems were integrated so that the computer systems, when an order came in, the signal didn't just go to Dell, but right to the suppliers. And so the idea is that they were quote virtually integrated with their suppliers. And so again, choosing to have very close ties to their suppliers, both geographically and technologically, etc., and their relationship-wise. Again, not necessarily an independent choice, but a choice that came because of other choices. All right. Well then, but still the problem is you still sort of need to know a little bit ahead of time, at least what you're going to want from consumers. Well, what sort of products or inputs you're going to need. Well, for that you need to closely monitor customer buying trends, right? If you want to have just-in-time inventory replenishment, you've got to monitor buying trends so you know when you need to get more of one component, less of another. Let your suppliers know. Well, how do you do that? Well, guess what? IBM, Compaq, and HP, they couldn't do it. Why couldn't they do it? Because they didn't actually sell to their end users. Remember, 70%, 75% of their sales were through resellers. So if they wanted to know what the consumer actually was buying, they would have to ask their resellers. And they did not have direct sales to their customers, so they couldn't actually have close monitoring of buying trends, which means that they couldn't have the same just-in-time inventory replenishment, etc. Right? But Dell could, because Dell had these direct sales to customers. So lo and behold, it all comes full circle. Because of the direct sales, Dell was able to do the close monitoring of buying trends that IBM, Compaq, and HP weren't able to do. Right? Well, built-to-order manufacturing, low inventory, avoiding the retailers or resellers, these things here, this all reduces your cost, right? Which allows you to price low, which they did to capture share. Arguably, you could actually get a better, higher quality Dell PC for less than you would get a Compaq or HP PC for a while, and Dell's market share, exploded. Oops. The point being, well, you'll notice, what did we just do? We made one choice. We put direct sales to customers, and every other choice was a logical extension of the last one. It was not an independent choice, right? It was an interdependent choice. That's the idea of fit, alignment, and coherence. It's very, very much illustrated by Dell's successful activity system back in the 1990s, at least. Now, meanwhile, there's the new example that's in the reading on Can You Save Your Strategy is Edward Jones. Right? We've already talked about Edward Jones' distinct positioning, right, and choosing to locate rurally and serve the individual investor, not serve institutional investors, and not have certain products and things. Their entire activity system, and again, and I'm not going to go into detail as I just did with Dell on this, but their entire activity system is designed around their target customer, their target location, their target, but the idea is serving the individual investor, the individual conservative investor willing to delegate decisions. Everything in the activity system is designed to target that customer. That's the idea of fit, alignment, coherence, consistency, So one of these ideas here then is, what we're getting at, is that strategic thinking is really systems thinking. So on the left, traditional thinking on competitive advantage, think about this. How often have you heard about competitive advantage is related to things like key success factors, core competencies, critical resources, right? So say, what are the key things, the critical things, the core, what are the individual elements that are driving advantage, right? So there's sort of, in other words, by implication, what they're saying is they believe that advantage is concentrated in specific elements of the organization, right? It's determined by just a few parts of the overall whole, right? What are I see the whole activity system. What are the key parts of the activity system? What are the individual things that are really causing that? But the reality is that strategy is about systems thinking, right? It's advantage is actually driven by all your choices, right? And the interdependence among these. It's not driven by isolated elements of the organization, but instead by the entire system. So notions of key success factors, core competencies, critical resources are acting like there is an individual things that you can identify and copy, or if you want, but there's individual best practices or individual choices or resources or competencies or things that explain the advantage. But the answer is no. The advantage is explained by everything. It's the whole together. So, in other words, it's not just about having the right parts, right? But it's about putting them together in the right way, right? And so finally get to use this picture, right? So here we see a plane with, what looks like probably the right parts, but they're clearly not put together in the right way. It's not about the individual parts. It's about how you put them together. All right, so we've covered the why, both looking at diagnosis of the challenge and the objective. We've covered the where, right, the scope part of the guiding policy. We covered the what, right, the added value part, the advantage, right, of part of the guiding policy, right, the value proposition. And finally, the how, the set of coherent actions or the activity system. And so we've covered really the readings on the kernel of good strategy as well as the elements of the strategy statement. Right? So in other words, this is the perils of bad strategy article, and this is the can you save your strategy. So we've actually covered what's in each of those and applied them to DARPA in each case. Right? Well, which brings us back to our what is strategy reading from the course case. Right? And at this point, we've actually covered most of it. But we haven't really covered the last two. And we get to what is the point, what is the title of this presentation, or is in the title of this presentation, what is the point of it, right? Which is the idea of trade-offs and focus as the essence of strategy, right? And how well DARPA illustrates that. So let's talk about this. So it's all sort of built up to this. It's all built up to now. But now is a good time to... This is the finish of part 2 of the video of the DARPA presentation. And so I will end this now and come back. We'll pick up right here with part 3.